Good morning. It's great to have you all here, and it's an honor for me to be here for the first time with such an esteemed guest for a conversation on politics.
Yeah. What's his name, our magic friend?
Well, welcome the eventual Republican nominee in 2024 up here at the end of this conversation.
There they are.
Karl will decide like he usually does. It's great to be here with Karl, who we all know as a veteran Republican political strategist, going back to his first meeting with George W. Bush in 1973, his work at College Republicans, but he's also an esteemed author, and his book, Courage and Consequence, a terrific read about politics, about public service in the White House. But I thought we'd begin, Karl, this conversation looking at another book you wrote, The Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters. Mm-hmm. And I was reading it again the other day, and it's clear it's very relevant as we think through this political moment. 1896, you may have read the book. If you haven't, Karl, help us understand when we look back at that election and that time, what it can help us understand about the chaos and division of today's Washington.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back, and thanks, Bob, for rereading the book. As he can tell you, it's a hell of a read.
It is, and it's available outside.
Yeah. Look, it may sound sort of dry, but it's got sex and violence and backstabbing and betrayal.
That sounds like an alternative fact.
And everybody has really cool nicknames. Didn't you love the cool nicknames?
That's true.
The Republican nominee is the Napoleon of Protection, and the Democratic nominee is the Boy Orator of the Platte. And there are Republican bosses, and they call themselves the Combine, and they're led by the easy boss, Senator Thomas Collier Platt of New York. And the front runner for the Democratic nomination, the leader of the silver forces inside the Democratic Party, who for 20 years has led the fight for the free and unlimited coinage of silver at 16-1, a cause he calls the cause of humanity itself, is Silver Dick from Missouri. Dick, I thought it meant something different when I read it in the New York Times. But anyway.
Karl, we just saw some punches almost thrown during the speaker vote. And I thought to myself when I was inside of the House of Representatives, it never was like this before. But then I was reading again in your book, the election of 1890, when the GOP wins the House.
Yeah.
Remind us about what it was like then.
So 1888, the Republicans, 2 years off, but that's okay.
Sorry.
Look, first of all.
It was a long day of travel.
Look, let's be honest. And let me start just outside of the Gilded Age. Almost everybody in this room remembers when our politics was more broken than it is today. Late 1960s, early 70s. Campus is aflame. Cities up in flames when Martin Luther King is assassinated. It looked like our country was coming apart. We had a bigot running for president twice, 1968 and 1972. And our politics was broken, and somehow it got healed. You think it's bad today, go back to the Gilded Age. We have 20 years of divided government, 2 years with a Republican president, House and Senate, 2 years with a Democratic president, House and Senate, but they hate each other, and nothing gets done because they're still fighting the Civil War. When the Democrats take control of the House in 1874, for the first time in 18 years, it's called the Victory of the Brigadiers, because so many former Confederate officers are elected. And you read the congressional record, you'll be shocked. I'm reading the dry debate in 1884 over a tariff measure, and the Democrats who are in the majority expect to win, and they lose unexpectedly because of defections. And one Democrat gets up and begins to excoriate his colleague who led the defections, who's the former Democratic Speaker of the House, and it's deeply personal and vicious. And finally, the former Speaker, Samuel Randall of Pennsylvania, has had enough. He stands up and says, the member's violating the decorum of the House. And the member turns to him and says, I would not blank you if you were a dog. 4 letters, starts with an F, ends with a K. You fill in the rest. That's in the congressional record. Remember 2 years ago, the woman in Iowa who won election by 7 votes, Marianna Meeks, and the Democrats said, let's investigate that. And then they said, we did that in 1984 with the bloody 8th. The Republican was elected congressman in Indiana by 36 votes. Speaker Wright says we're going to investigate it. They throw out the Republican, replace him with a Democrat, and it poisoned the well in the House for years afterwards. So they decided not to do it with Marianna Meeks. During the last 25 years of the 19th century, Guess how many times the majority party in the House of Representatives, Democrat or Republican, would phony up an election challenge against a member who had won by a small number of votes and kick out the minority member and replace him with the member of the majority party to build their numbers. You want to guess how many times in 25 years? How about 55?
Wow.
In fact, in 1884, the future president of the United States, William McKinley, who's won re-election by 50 votes legitimately in his swing district in Ohio, is kicked out by the Democratic majority in 1884 before the election. And the only thing that is unusual about it is that 7 leading Democrats vote to retain him as a mark of respect. But this happened routinely. The fever finally breaks in 1902 when John Schoforth, a Democrat congressman from Colorado, who's been elected by a small number of votes. They have an election commission that looks into the election. He watches it, stands up on the floor of the House on the day it's going to make his report and says, I've paid careful attention to the deliberations of the Elections Committee, and I've concluded that in 29 precincts in my district, illegitimate and illegal activity by members of my party has resulted in my inappropriate and illegal election to this body. I ask you to join with me in voting to expel me from the House and replace me with my Republican opponent. He wins election as governor of Colorado 2 years later on the slogan of Honest John. But that's what it took. And you know, look, remember when we had the battle over shutting down the government unless you repeal Obamacare, and we had the, you know, sort of the few days where that was all about?
10 years ago this year.
10 years ago this year. In 1890, 1890. So the Republicans have a narrow majority and in the House, and the Democrats, back then they were sort of civilized. You got sworn in March, there was no air conditioning, so everybody was sent home until October, November, and you came back and the Congress began to meet in the fall when it got cool in Washington. Democrats announced that they will not answer a single roll call, thereby denying the House a quorum. Have a vote, Republicans win, the Democrat stands up and says there's no quorum present. They call the quorum, no Democrat answers the roll call, and as a result, the vote doesn't count. So for October, November, and December of 1889, not a single bill is passed in the House of Representatives. No post office, no budget bill, no nothing. In early January of 1890, Thomas Brackett Reed, the Speaker of the House, decides he's had enough. So he directs the Sergeant at Arms that there will be a vote, and the vote is on expelling a West Virginia Democrat who won re-election by a handful of votes with his Republican opponent. And when he calls that vote, the sergeants at arms are supposed to take up station at each one of the doors around the House chamber and allow no one to leave. And a separate crew is to take boards and barricade the doors on the outside. So they have the motion, they have the vote, the Republicans win, a Democrat stands up from Kentucky and says, I do not believe a quorum is present. The clerk calls the roll, no Democrat answers the roll call. They're all, spitting on the floor and, smoking cigarettes and feeling really good about themselves. And Reed says to the clerk, the chair directs the clerk to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, Mr. Winter present, calls out the name of every Democrat on the House floor. One, you can imagine what happens. They all run for the exits. One gets out. Constantine August of Rusk County, Texas, beats the crap out of the Sergeant at Arms and uses his cowboy boots to kick out the slats in the door of the House of Representative chamber and make good his escape. The guy who started it all stands up and screams at Reed, under God and the Constitution, you have no right to count me present without my permission, to which Reed, who's about 6'3", 300 pounds, looks sort of like a bowling pin with a walrus mustache painted on. He says very calmly, does the honorable gentleman from Kentucky deny he's present upon the floor of the House? This kicks off a nearly 2-month-long debate that is ultimately settled by the U.S. Supreme Court as to whether or not the Speaker has the power to do this. And in the meantime, for almost 5 months, not a single bill is passed in the House of Representatives. The debate that begins the very next day, one of the first speakers is William Henry Howdy Martin of Texas, 6'6" tall, thin as a rail, mean as a snake, fought the entire Civil War with Hood's Brigade. He stands up, points a bony finger at Reed, and says, if any member will order me to remove this dictator from his position of power upon the podium, I will do so by force forthwith. Reed says, the honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order, and moves on. Martin is so pissed off the next day, he comes in, sits right in the front row in front of the speaker's podium on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, pulls out his 16-inch long Bowie knife, and spends the entire day sharpening it on his boot sole in an attempt to menace the Speaker of the House. Now, our politics is bad, but correct me if I'm wrong, did Nancy Pelosi do that with her stilettos when she turned it over to McCarthy? I can't remember. Tell me if it's.
I mean, listening to that, Carl, McCarthy thinks Matt Gaetz is tough. I mean, that was much tougher back then.
And 15 votes to get Speaker. How about 35 votes to get to be president? Do you remember the election of 1800? Thomas Jefferson. You know, it ends in a tie in the Electoral College because his running mate, Aaron Burr, is supposed to tell a couple of buddies from New York not to vote for him, so that back then you voted for the president and the vice president. You know, the vice president was whoever got the second most number of votes. Burr is supposed to tell a couple of his buddies that not to vote for me, so Jefferson comes out on top. Doesn't happen. Wonder why. So on February 11th of 1801, the election of the 1800 is tossed into the House of Representatives, and at noon, in the midst of a blinding snowstorm in Washington, D.C., the House of Representatives meets. 1 vote per state, need 9 votes in order to win. The vote is held at noon in the midst of a blinding snowstorm. And it looks like Jefferson is going to lose because Maryland has 4 Democrats and 4 Federalists, but one of the Democrats is ill and thought to be dying. He insists upon being carried on a stretcher 2 miles through the blinding snowstorm in order to be installed in a room next to the floor so that he can deadlock Maryland, and they vote at noon, and it is inconclusive. They vote every hour on the hour for 24 hours. Every one of them the same. And the next day, the second day, they say, wait a minute, you know what? Let's slow this thing up. Let's vote 1 time a day and see if we can't come to a reason. On the 35th ballot, it finally breaks. The next week. And it breaks by the unlikely intervention of an unlikely figure, Alexander Hamilton. He has written a letter to George Baird, the Federalist congressman from Delaware, and said, I hate them. I hate them both. But at least Jefferson has character and Burr has none. Given the choice between 2 evils, take the lesser every time. So on the 35th ballot, Baird says, I'm cashing in Delaware. We're no longer supporting Burr. I'm going to convince a fellow Federalist from Vermont to throw it in so that Vermont will now go to Jefferson. Jefferson can be elected. And I'm going to tell my fellow Federalists from Maryland and South Carolina, it's done, boys. Let's go home. Jefferson's going to be president. And on the 35th ballot, on February 17th of 1801, Jefferson is elected president and sworn into office 15 days later. So we're screwed up, but they were screwed up too, and they got over it.
Let's move a little bit. That's a great point. Back to the 1896 moment for just a second. When you look at 1896, it's not just about McKinley. It's about Williams, Jennings, Bryan. Mm-hmm. And America seemed to be having a populist moment at the turn of the century. And many would argue now in the country, populism is again on the rise. People like Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Sanders, and the Democratic Party, populist progressives, and on the right, the rise of Trump and his allies with their nationalism. There's a populist moment. Bryan saw it, Jennings Bryan saw it, McKinley saw it. How does that populist moment from that period overlap with today's, if at all?
Yeah, well, it does, because populism, as you point out, can be on the right or the left. Populism at its core is a belief that the system is rigged, that the system is corrupt, that the little man or little woman is being screwed over. From the right, it's because of big government, and from the left, it's because of big corporations and the money power. And yet the language is interesting. Go online and read the Cross of Gold speech, which is a total accident, as I brilliantly explain in my book. But in the course of it, Bryan says there are 2 forms of economic theory. The Republican theory is that prosperity will trickle down from above, and the Democratic theory is that it will rise up from below. But it was populist. It was a populism of the left. The system is rigged against the little guy. And what was interesting was McKinley's answer was, we're all in this together. We need to have an economy and a country in which every American is respected, in which every American has an opportunity to succeed. And he runs a relentlessly positive campaign and does something to unify the country that for the time was completely unexpected. William McKinley entered the Civil War as a private, an Ohio private in April of 1861, and ends the war as a major, having received 3 battlefield promotions for unspeakable bravery. He is recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor, but refuses to have his application pressed because he said, "I was only doing my duty." He survived 2 suicide missions. One suicide mission at the Battle of Kernstown in the Shenandoah Valley. He literally rides, is ordered by his commander, a brigade commander, a colonel, to ride across an open battlefield in front of the Union forces to get a critical message to a group of Union troops who are about ready to be cut off. And he makes it, his tent mate said, we thought he was going to die because he was riding literally across this battlefield. And when he gets the message to the 13th West Virginia and they retreat in good order, he rides back behind the lines, walks into his commander's new tent, and his brigade commander, Rutherford B. Hayes, turns around and says, "I never expected to see you in this life again." So he's a Civil War veteran, a Union hero. And he does the first thing, he's the first Republican candidate for president to appear. He invites a group of Confederate veterans from the campaign where they were trying to kill him to visit him in Canton, Ohio, which is hard for us to understand what that meant, but that was an effort at national reconciliation. He said, he said to these graying Confederate veterans, "If we're ever forced to fight again, and God forbid that we shall be as brothers, united in the common cause." So, here was a guy who, is unrecognized by history today, but was a remarkable human being. And what he did was he said, "We're all in this together," and found a way to bring the country together after a divisive quarter of a century.
It was 50 years ago this year, as I noted, that you first met George W. Bush. Tell us the story of that first encounter at Union Station in Washington, D.C.
Well, it wasn't really Union Station. It was the Republican National Committee. He was
coming in from Union
Station. Actually, there's one pre-story. So I've just been elected College Republican National Chairman, and me and my young executive director, who's actually a year or two older than I was, were summoned, but we were in the sub-basement underneath the parking garage of the Republican National Committee. We were down there with the janitorial staff and the printing shop and all the other broken toys. And we were summoned to the 4th floor to be given the lecture by the chairman of the Republican National Committee, a tall, athletic Texas oilman named George H.W. Bush. And so me and my executive director, Harvey Lee Atwater of South Carolina, are summoned, and we're given the lecture. "Boys, we're giving you a budget. Don't waste it. We're going to give you assignments. Do it. I don't want funny business. I don't want interacy and warfare. I want adult behavior, and if there is not, there will be consequences." Have I made myself clear? Yes, sir. "Do you have any questions?" And at that, Lee Atwater, unbeknownst to me, had a question. And when Lee would talk, he would stutter, and his clothes would sort of magically begin. "Mr. Chairman, I got a question." "Yes, Lee, what is it?" Is it true you keep a Boston whaler with 2 Evinrude 387s on the Potomac River?" "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I do." "Can I borrow it this weekend? There's a really cute girl coming up from South Carolina. It would really impress her if I could. I've handled the crap before, and I'll return it full of gas." And I'm going, what the is he doing? It had just enough chutzpah that Bush said, "Okay." So this is our contact with him. This is it. We've had 5 minutes. We've been sternly lectured, and my one paid staffer has now gotten us into trouble by borrowing a boat. So I'm like, this is not starting out very well. So for reasons that are completely inexplicable, 5 weeks later, I got a phone call from the chairman's chief of staff, a fellow named Tom Lass. And this is at a point where the Republican National Committee has 63 employees. And the phone call is, Chairman Bush would like to know if you would like to become his special assistant. So in late October of '73, at the age of 22, I go to work for George H.W. Bush. And the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Tom says, well, actually it was Tuesday. He said, "Tomorrow, the chairman is going to be down at the White House in the afternoon. I'm going to be up on Capitol Hill. And his son, W, is coming down from Harvard Business School This is pre-cell phone. So when he gets to Union Station, he's going to call, and you go to the lobby and meet him and give him the keys to the family car because he's going to drive out to Spring Valley in Northwest Washington, where the family's home was, and be there that afternoon, and we'll get the chairman home that night. So I said, great. So the phone call comes. The formidable Rose Zamaria, Bush's longtime secretary, tells me to go to the lobby. So I go to the lobby, and this may be hard to fathom, but I was the complete nerd. So I'm like the complete nerd. So there I am, like goofy nerd, and in walks this guy with a National Guard flight jacket, cowboy boots, Levi's, little round thing in the back pocket, cheek and gum, exuding more charisma than anybody should, and he's like, here to get my keys. How you doing, little guy? And I give him the keys to the family car, which is some of you will remember these. It was a Gremlin, an AMC Gremlin. A purple Gremlin with Levi Strauss interior. The Bushes had a longtime sort of, aide named Don Rhodes, and Don was the cheapest human being ever. And he could care less what the car looked like as long as it was cheap, and so he had bought the Bush family a purple Gremlin. So the Harvard Business School guy who's been working in the oil patch earned enough money to pay for his own college and also to buy a little red sports car to drive around Harvard Yard to impress the co-eds, is given the keys to the purple Gremlin with Levi Strauss. Let's say it wasn't an auspicious beginning to our relationship.
You've spent the decade since building the Republican Party in Texas, nationally. Where is the Republican Party today?
Well, it's a mess. It's ironic. Parties can be simultaneously strong and weak. And the Republican Party does have strengths. Take the last election. Normally what happens, because of the distribution of what congressional districts look like, because of the Voting Rights Act, there are a lot more congressional districts that are Democrat that have 75 or 70% or 80% Democrat than there are Republican districts that have the same notion. So typically in a competitive election for the House, the Republicans are a point or two behind in the popular vote, and we were 4 points ahead this time around. And yet we have an anemic majority in the House. And it's because we have a dozen seats where we put up terrible candidates. And we put up the guy in Western Michigan against Peter Meyer, endorsed by Trump because Peter Meyer had voted for Trump's impeachment. The guy had no connection to the district, had born on the other side of the state, had moved there to run on the opposite side of the state, in a place that's pretty parochial. And he said nutty things. He'd written a paper when he was at Stanford Law saying that all of America's modern problems emerged from the amendment that was passed and approved, came into force in 1920, allowing women to have the vote. And when he was asked about it, rather than saying I was young and stupid at one point, he tried to defend the thesis. But we did that time and time again across the country. We had the guy who in 2020 put together the gigantic display in his front yard in a rural part of northwestern Ohio that praised President Trump. I don't know if you've ever seen.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, the pictures of it are extraordinary. This guy's like really weird because he's got like the huge display with flags and styrofoam head of Trump and all kinds of weird stuff.
I think he had music videos.
And I mean, it was just weird. But anyway, Trump saw it and heard about it, so he endorses him for Congress. And the guy says, well, I'm a combat veteran to boot. And well, it turned out he was not a combat veteran of Afghanistan or Iraq. He was a loader on the flight line in Qatar for a couple of months, loading airplanes. And it turned out, he said, well, I was reduced in rank because I got in a fight in a bar, and then it was in the dormitory. Well, it turned out he got reduced in rank because shortly after 9/11, he was caught driving a large piece of equipment on an airbase completely and totally drunk. And it was only because it was after 9/11 and we needed everybody on deck that he wasn't thrown out of the Air Force. But that's the kind of person that we ended up, and you add them up, and I count at least 12 of them that we lost, and some of them by a point or two that we should have won because we had bad candidates. And we are at a point where we're not, the governor of Ohio, you remember when Ohio was a battleground state? Timken remembers it. And the governor of Ohio gets reelected by 27 points, and every one of the rest of the Republican ticket wins by 22 22 to 24 points, except for the U.S. Senate candidate who wins by 7. And why? Because he can't make a case to the people of his state that he ought to be their representative in the United States Senate. So he gets elected, but he gets carried in on the coattails of everybody else but below him. Florida used to be a battleground state. Remember that? DeSantis wins by 19.4 points, the largest victory of any Republican in the history of the state, and carries the rest of the ticket and 2/3 of the state legislature in with him. So we're simultaneously strong but weak because, and there's a lot of admirable things about Donald Trump, but he is not the strong, effective leader at the top of the ticket.
I would never ask you to speak for the former president, but how do you see President George W. Bush's role in American life since he left the White House?
He made a decision that he was going to be a former president, not somebody on the stage. He very much believes that it was his job is to do everything he could, leave nothing back, put it all out on the field, and then let the next guys come along. And he feels rather strongly about it. I mean, he did not get into public life in order to be in the public's face. He wanted to achieve things and do things. And he's still very active, but it's things that are, he's very active in AIDS efforts in Africa, which I don't know if you know this, but I mean, do you know where America is most popular? I was talking with Mike Milken the other day about this, and he said they did survey work all around the world. Do you know where America is most popular around the world? Sub-Saharan Africa. And do you know why? Because we've saved the lives of millions of people with PEPFAR and the AIDS relief effort that was begun under Bush. And he's still active in that. He's very active. There's not a week goes by that he does not work with and meet with veterans, and particularly wounded warriors, because he feels a keen responsibility. Those men and women went into harm's way on his order, and he feels a personal responsibility for what happened to him. And so he is with them all the time, doing things to help make their lives better. He's also involved in efforts on immigration and education, but his object, and energy and national security, but his object is not to be the guy. It's his job, he thinks, to help facilitate other people to step forward and help lead the country, particularly a younger generation.
Speaking of the military, when you look at Congress now, one of the big debates in the coming months will be how to handle Ukraine, especially with divided government, how the Republicans in the House will interact with President Biden on this issue. The Bush years, the Bush 43 years, there was an interventionist strain in the Republican Party about having some kind of influence in the world, whether it's on the ground in a war or just in terms of advocating for democracy. Is that strain, that dynamic, still a vital part of the Republican Party today, especially with Ukraine?
Yeah, well, it's diminished somewhat, but only somewhat. Because you may have seen on Sunday, for example, my neighbor in Austin, Michael McCall, who's the new chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, he was asked about this comment by a Republican from Arizona saying we shouldn't give tanks to Ukraine because American military will be driving those tanks. And McCall said, no, we're giving the tanks to Ukraine so Ukrainians can drive tanks. And so there is an element in our party. If you want to step back, though, think about this. One of the amazing bipartisan agreements last year with a Democrat House, then a Democrat Senate, was that the proposal of a Democrat president with regard to national security was completely insufficient. And as a result, led by Democrat Chairman Adam Smith of House Armed Services and his minority counterpart, Mike Rogers, the House plussed up the defense budget by $75 billion. Because they said we face China, we face North Korea, we face Russia, we've got to rebuild our military stocks, we've got to modernize our military. And that was done in spite of the president saying, no, I want to spend here. They said spend here. And that happened with a huge bipartisan vote on two measures, the defense budget and on what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And I think that's still there. Look, I went to Ukraine for the first time in Kiev in 1993. It was a dusty, grimy, ugly town. And they were just freed from the Soviet domination. I've been back 4 times since. Three years ago was my last visit, just before the COVID. Kiev is a bright, shining city full of exciting people who love the fact that they're living in freedom and look to the West. They want to emulate us. They want the American dream, but they want it in Ukraine. And they know they've got problems. They've got leftover problems with corruption and oligarchs, but they want to live in freedom. And if we allow the Russians to subjugate Ukraine, Putin made it clear in his July 2020 statement that he views that Ukraine is an integral part of Russia, as are the Baltic regions and parts of Poland and Croatia. If you want to see the old Soviet Union come back, turn a blind eye to the brutality and the horror that he is inflicting upon a peaceful people. And so, yeah, I think there will be a bipartisan consensus to support in Ukraine. And it's not to say we're not critical. I'm personally critical. They should have moved faster and quicker, but they've at least moved, meaning the administration. And there's, I think, bipartisan consensus that's going to defend this policy. And we have no choice. If you think it's in our self-interest as a country to have a Europe that is bullied by the Russians, you're kidding yourself. You're kidding yourself. It will hurt our trade, our prosperity. It will change the world order. If you think Ukraine goes, what do you think North Korea is going to think about South Korea? What do you think that China is going to think about Taiwan? What do you think Iran is going to think about the Middle East? All the bad actors in the world are going to be emboldened. Not a single American has died in Ukraine wearing our uniform. There are Americans who've died, but they went there voluntarily to fight on behalf of freedom for Ukraine. But the Ukrainians are dying, and they're dying for the concept that we hold dear of freedom and self-determination as a people. And by God, we better stand with them.
I know many in here are regular readers of your column in the Wall Street Journal. Terrific read. But for those who may not have read your most recent columns, give us, Karl, if you wouldn't mind, a cold Karl Rove political assessment of two major figures, President Biden and former President Trump.
One's a loser. Well, maybe both. Actually, I'll give it to you. I'll give them to you together. So, anybody here from South Dakota? Remember Bill Janklow? Complete madman. Bill Janklow was the longtime Attorney General of the state, and then he was the governor, and he was a wild man. And 41 years ago, Janklow and an attorney, do you know the Abdullahs? What was the old man's name? Gene Abdullah and Bill Janklow. South Dakota has a substantial Lebanese-American population, and Scott Abdullah was the leading attorney in the state, or Gene Abdullah. So Gene Abdullah and Janklow started the South Dakota Law Enforcement Gala, and Appreciation Gala. And they hire a speaker to come and give a patriotic speech, and it's like 2,000 people in what's looks like a barn, and it's America. It really is fantastic. They got the crazy Catholic priest who has been giving the invocation for decades and shows up, of course, with the invocation this year on a whiteboard. And every political person in the state is there, and Thune is there and introduces me, and the Supreme Court Justice leads you, the Chief Justice leads you in the pledge, and the woman who sang at the state fair does a spectacular rendition of the national anthem, and it's America. And I mean, it's like, where's Marty Evans? Marty Evans from Beckwith? Marty has for 11 years been donating 950 pounds of prime rib, which you're enjoying tonight. Everybody enjoying the prime rib tonight. Everybody, show Marty your appreciation, class. Anyway, so I give the speech, a little patriotic thing, and they said, but we want you to shorten it up so you give Q&A. So I got the Q&A, and it's huge. I mean, this is a big place. And there's this guy in the back, and they give him a mic. He said, what do you think about Biden running again? And I said, well, I'm going to piss off every Democrat in the room. I don't think he ought to run. He's 82. He'd be 82 if he ran. If he served 4 years, he'd be 86. He'd be closer to 90 than 80. And he's struggling. I said, I worked in that place for 7 years. There's a reason why everybody who occupies that job comes out looking older. The demands are enormous. And we need a younger, more energetic president than we got, in my opinion. And I said, now I'm going to irritate every Republican in the room. It shouldn't be the 78-year-old Donald Trump. I said he lost. It was chaotic. And he's not prepared to do it again. Is this really what we want for our country? I said, look, we're 1959, 1960. We got an admirable president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, but he was born in the 19th century. And the American people said in 1960, we want one of these two young combat veterans of the war in the Pacific, 40-some-odd-year-old John F. Kennedy or 40-some-odd-year-old Richard Nixon. And the election of Kennedy ushers in a 32-year period during which we were blessed to be governed by presidents who were part of the greatest generation. Starting with Kennedy and ending with George H.W. Bush, who is the youngest Navy fighter pilot in World War II at the age of 18, enlists when he's barely 17. Then we elect Bill Clinton. And for 32 years, we have been governed by presidents who have been drawn from the baby boomer generation, or in the case of Biden, the generation before the baby boomers, called the silent generation. And I said, why isn't 32 years enough? I said, the country faces big challenges, the world is a dangerous place, and we need young, dynamic leadership, Republican or Democrat, and there are plenty of them out there. And I thought, I'm here in deep red South Dakota, and I'm now saying no to both of these people. I knew there'd be some applause for the first notion. The place went wild. I think the country is ready for a change. We know in our heart of hearts that our country deserves better. Go to the panel with James Carville and somebody ask him the same question. You'll get the same answer.
Looking ahead to 2024, before we get to the presidential, you spend so much of your time these days looking at the House races, the Senate races, the gubernatorial races. Leave the presidential to the side. What's your outlook on 2024 on those levels?
Yeah. Set the governors aside, because there are very few governors races, and they generally are in states that are either red or blue. So that's not going to be much. But the Senate, the Republicans had a tough election this year because we had several senators or seats up in states that Donald Trump lost and Joe Biden won. And we had no Democrats up in seats that Donald Trump won. This next time around, and we had twice as many up as they had. Table gets turned next time. Twice as many Democrats up as Republicans. The Republicans are up in places like, Utah, Texas, the Dakotas. Don't have to worry about those. Wyoming. Democrats, however, have senators up in Montana, West Virginia, and Ohio.
I don't want to interrupt, Karl, but you say don't worry. Sometimes in red states, candidate quality can become an issue.
Yeah, my sense is that lesson was learned well enough in the Senate side in 2022 that the Republicans are going to care about that next time around. And besides, in most instances, it's going to be incumbents who are running. I mean, you may be able to make the argument that we could do better than Theodore Cruz in Texas, but he's going to be running and they won't come up with somebody.
Sounds like a lot of love there.
Yeah. Well, I just said he was going to win, so he ought to be kind of happy with that. And Wyoming, same thing. I mean, we got John Barrasso is up, and they're not going to come up with somebody. But
do you think a lot of Democrats retire between now and then?
I think a couple do, yeah. I mean, particularly, Dianne Feinstein is going to retire because she's 89. But even if they don't retire, John Tester and Sherrod Brown and Joe Manchin have got problems. I mean, if you're Sherrod Brown, if you get a good candidate against you, you're in trouble in a state that the Republicans have just carried in the governor's race by 27 points. After you've and where your Senate candidate, Ryan was he's a very effective candidate, far better than our candidate, and yet he still came up short by 7 points. And I don't see the Democrats making a contest for Ohio on the presidential level next time around. Ohio is no longer a swing state. That state has swung in part because of the coalition that Donald Trump created, has swung into the Republican column for the foreseeable future. So the Democrats are going to have a trouble holding on to the Senate because in addition to those, you've got two states that they won by 0.3%, and one state that they won by 2.5%. And as a result, you're going to have, in a presidential election, or particularly if there's a tendency to swing against the party in power, they're going to be in trouble. House, I don't know. I think it's all going to depend upon, do the Republicans avoid the same mistakes they made this last time? I mean, we lost a seat, for example, in Washington State by 1 point with a complete lunatic on our ticket. That seat is likely to swing back into the Republican column. In fact, if you go in and look at these seats, like the Ohio seat that I mentioned or the 2 New Hampshire seats, there is strong evidence that that Republicans were saying, I'm not voting for that person. I'm not voting for the GOP nominee because I'm going to vote for my Republican state rep, Republican governor. In New Hampshire, Chris Sununu runs well ahead of the 2 Republican candidates for Congress in the state's districts there, and so do most of the Republican state legislative candidates.
A lot of it's going to depend on, again, candidates.
Right.
You look at Ohio, looks like Dolan, the Republican, who many, in let's say the Bush wing, the business wing of the Republican Party admire, he's going to run against Sherrod Brown. But someone like Mitch Daniels, who you know so well, just decided no thanks in Indiana. So you do wonder at this point early, do traditional Republicans, to use a phrase, just say to themselves, like Daniels did, maybe it's still messy, I don't want to have this primary war?
Well, that's not exactly what he said, and I know because I talked to him at length.
And his statement, it's worth reading his statement.
It is.
It's an indictment of Washington.
Well, but it's also Mitch. Mitch said, I'm 70 years old. I'd have to spend 2 years running and 6 years serving. I'd be 78, nearly 79 when I left. Is this how I want to spend 8 years of whatever time I got left? And here's a guy who doesn't need to hold an office in order to have an impact. Think about what he did in establishing a model for the entire country with his leadership of Purdue University. He's told every university president in the country, you can find ways to lower the cost for your students and improve the education that's available to them if you only set your mind to it. And what he has done to make Purdue even better, think about it. This is not a university that has kept tuition flat. It has reduced tuition across the board for every single student. Think how many more people are going to be able to go to college or to be able to end college without having a big pile of debt, because this guy said, let's take sound business principles and apply them to our higher education system and realize that our customer is the student, and our job is to give them the highest quality product at the lowest possible price. So he's I wish he would run, because I think he'd be the conscience of the Senate. But also look in your own life. There are things that you said, that'd be nice, but I'm not going to do it because I want to spend what time I have left doing something else. And I think he's right.
News just broke in the last few days that Governor DeSantis of Florida will be heading to Texas, your state, in March, in early March, for some high-profile dinners. It's a sign he's potentially moving toward a 2024 presidential bid. Former Ambassador Nikki Haley has signaled she's likely to jump in the race.
She's going to be in Texas on February 24th.
For your event?
Big political event.
I asked Karl if I could come. No reporters. I may try to stake it out.
You can come.
Say, Karl, I was with you in Rancho Mirage.
Yeah.
Let me in.
Yeah. No, look, you can come. It's just up to them to decide to talk to you. You can't be in the room. But if I were you, I'd come. If I were you, I'd come and sleuth around.
I'll take any excuse to go to Austin.
Yeah.
But what do you make of this?
We need the money. Come on, spend generously.
You have Elon Musk living there now.
Settle up your bar bill, however, before you leave town.
Fair enough.
Like last time.
But so Ambassador Haley inching closer. DeSantis certainly seems to be thinking about it at the very least. Yeah. Governor Youngkin in Virginia. In the final few minutes here, where are we in terms of watching this 2024 Republican presidential race, and how do you see the movement in a way perhaps we don't?
Yeah. Well, I just finished turning in my column for tomorrow, so I'll give you a preview.
Thank you.
I'm awaiting the editor. I hope she's gentle with me today. Look, first of all, it's early. And I make 3 points in there. One, people don't need to get in now. Trump didn't enter the contest until June 15th. Bush didn't enter the contest in 1999 until late June. And it's all this, they can go walk around the country, they can go give speeches, they can go talk, they can go make friends. And it matters to do that before you formally announce, because if you talk to somebody before you announce, you're saying you're important enough to me that I came to see you before I jumped in. And they lose that benefit when they jump in. So point one is, don't be rushed. Trump got in November. That was a mistake. He's floundered since. It's hard to sustain things that long. Better to be under the radar and chart your own path, meet people on your turf, and two of them have got day jobs that, actually three of them, Brian Kemp of Georgia, Youngkin of Virginia, and DeSantis of Florida are all, and Chris Sununu of New Hampshire, all sitting governors. They got legislative sessions to attend to. Second point is that ignore the attacks, unless it allows you to do a little political jiu-jitsu. Trump coming out and attacking DeSantis as Ron Sanctimonious, it was exciting when it was at 2015 and 16 because he was punching up. Now he's punching down. And when you punch down, it makes you look weak. And, why he's doing it is beyond me. It's just, I think he's scared, which is why he's doing it.
And it's a different world politically between now and 2015.
Yeah.
8 years,
He
lots changed.
Can't adjust. And then the third thing is the Republicans had better figure out, however, how to get in a place where the field trims down quickly. In February of 2020, Trump got 33% of the vote and 84% of the delegates, because the other 67% of the vote was split among so many candidates, they failed to get the threshold, to reach the threshold to get delegates. That was in February. In early March, he gets 45% of the delegates, with, again, about 34% of the vote, because, again, started to consolidate, but still you have too many people chasing too few delegates. In the latter half of March, he gets like 40-something percent, 41% I think it is. I got the right number in the column. But he gets like 56% of the delegates. I'm sorry, 67% of the delegates. He doesn't start getting more than 50% of the vote until May. But because there are too many people out there in the field still getting 3%, 10%, 5%, so forth, it split it up. So the Republicans had better figure out how to say to people, thank you for making a shot, but you're not getting there, and my checkbook is closed, my network is unavailable, and I'm turning my attention elsewhere. Anyway, it's a good column, I think. We'll see.
Wall Street Journal columnist, author, and veteran political strategist Karl Rove, thank you for being here.
Thank you.